Hi, everybody. I'm Victor Payan.
And I'm Pocha Peña.
And welcome to Dreamocracy in America,
the show that picks up where de Tocqueville left off.
Yes, we're having a bunch of national conversations, and we're just completing our second month. And a lot has happened in 2 months. So we've got, 100,000 people dead. We've got the rioting in Minneapolis. We've got
a lot of police brutality and revolt.
We've got the whole issue. We've got the quarantine. So the whole issue of voting by mail or not voting by mail, a whole slew of voter fraud being cooked up for us. But we've also got some conversations, some really amazing people that are doing important work that we call Dreamocracy building, because Dreamocracy is, we all know that democracy is kind of failing right now. And Dreamocracy is the work by all the people that were left out of the original conversations about what is America. This project is based on Alexis de Tocqueville, a French nobleman who came to the US in 1831. And he studied the prisons and he went around to what was the US at that time. And his book is a classic. You should read it, about what makes
Democracy in America.
What makes Americans tick, namely white Anglo-male Americans. So if you want to understand the roots of what's the meltdown right now, his book to this day will give you a blueprint.
It was very insightful. He's not Nostradamus, but he really got a lot right over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So we're picking up on where his conversations left off with a lot of the communities that he did not speak to, or perhaps were not a part of the U.S. in 1831.
Yeah, so that's Native American, that's women, that's dreamers, that's Asian American, African American, LGBTQ. And
this week, actually, we have a very sad anniversary, and that's the anniversary of Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act.
Yes, yesterday was the 190th anniversary of the Indian Removal Act. So
it's a really bitter time in our history. Basically,
more bitter than sweet. It's not bitter.
Yeah,
it's bitter.
To break it down. The government basically told Native Americans that if they remained on their lands, the government could not assure their safety. So it was
from who?
From settlers. From
illegal settlers.
Not always the
yeah, it was
illegal.
Because they weren't
necessarily.
That wasn't their land.
The
really.
Treaties were being violated. So for this reason, because of an issue of personal safety, the natives were removed from their land and brought into areas that now are called reservations. And a lot of them didn't make it across the journey. It was a very arduous journey. A lot of times by foot. A lot of times their animals, their horses, their dogs, were not allowed to come with them. And of course, these were members of their tribe.
Yeah, and also, I mean, when you look at the history, because we like to look at history because the answers are all there for the current injustices and for
history tends to repeat
solutions of what those, how we address those injustices. But if you look at that period, people were moved from Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia to Oklahoma. That's a pretty big change. They lost their medicine, they lost their plants, they lost their hunting grounds, their familial, their roots. But also, the soldiers would also kill them. Like, oh, you can't make it, you're gonna stay here and die, or we'll just shoot you. But if you look at the Indian Removal Act text, it actually says that the land will be ceded back to the U.S. if the Indians become extinct. So you don't put that in a contract unless you're thinking that that's one of the outcomes that you need to be ready for. So even back then, it was a real problem.
Gives you the chills. Gives you the chills.
So
now today, we're speaking with someone that's done a lot of advocacy work with the Native American community, with the Native Americans in Texas, in addition to representing Native Americans in movies such as Tecumseh, and certainly being very active in continuing forth the lore and the cultural legacy of Mexican Americans, not just in Texas, throughout the Southwest, in film, in popular culture. We have somebody who's inhabited many roles that you're familiar with, reaching back all the way to Fame. Do y'all remember the original Fame of the High School of the Arts that took place in New York City?
Gonna Live Forever.
Gonna Live Forever, yes. And that's Jesse Borrego. So, and he's continued on to from mythic role to mythic role, all the way to Blood In and Blood Out.
Yeah. And VIDA LOCA, which were both in the same year. So some of you got like tattoos and stuff. of films that were from 1993, the same year, a pivotal year, right after the quincentenary, 1492 to 1992. So, but Jesse is really great because from his beginning of his career in the early 80s to the present, he's been an advocate for Latino representation. He's had some really great roles. He's in VIDA now, if you guys are fans of that series, VIDA.
On Stars.
Always opening doors and always, helping others to get into the industry, to be actors.
To learn the craft, to learn the technology.
And he's teaching online during this pandemic. So if you're a fan and you want to learn from Jesse, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So let's bring him on. Let's see if he's going to unmute himself here. Are you with us, Jesse Borrego?
I am here.
Hey!
Hey, everybody. Hope everybody's hanging on.
Welcome. Woo!
Thank you for inviting.
It's good to see you. I hear it's raining over there in San Antonio.
Yeah, it's hailing.
Off and on. I mean, the Texas weather, they say if you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes.
Yeah, some spectacular storms out there.
So we had tornadoes, then we had wind, then all of a sudden the sun came out and it was beautiful. Then it was almost like a summer day about 2 days ago. Now we've got a hurricane on the Gulf, so we get it all here.
Yeah, we were out there in January and it was like 70 degrees. Like we were out there 2 years ago and it was like 30 degrees, and then this year it was 70 degrees. It was global warming, man.
Yeah, yep. And our rainy season has shifted. Remember, it used to be kind of in April-ish.
Yeah.
Now it's kind of shifted more towards May. That's why we're getting all this weather and stuff like that. But it's good for us because it cleans the air out, and I'm not ready for the hot weather yet. Not ready for it yet.
No, but you know what they say? April showers bring May flowers.
May flowers.
And May flowers bring pilgrims. So anyways, tell us, I think you have a lot of fans in the audience tonight, and, they're familiar with your career, but tell us how you started, and we'll go into the different projects. And you got a new film coming out too.
Phoenix, Oregon, my new film drops Monday, June 1st. We come out on iTunes. But if anybody wants it on Apple TV this weekend, there's a very special pre-sale price. So it's half price if you want to get it now before Monday. So this weekend, you can snag it for a bargain. So I urge everyone to grab it pre-sale on Apple TV, Phoenix, Oregon. And
it's gotten great reviews. You just got a really nice write-up in the LA Times, right?
Mm-hmm. LA Times in Espanol. Definitely, we've gotten good feedback. The main thing I think that happened is we were able to do a feel-good maneuver with this, is because we were getting ready to, as an independent film, have a little bit of a theatrical opening, including the Santikos theaters here in San Antonio, which amazingly enough is going to open it next weekend back at the theater. So we're having a retro theatrical release, if you can believe it. Never heard of that.
Will you be there for the opening of the reopening of the screening in San Antonio?
Of the Santikos? I'm probably going to try to be, depending on the social distancing protocol. But yeah, as it starts to open up, definitely would love to be out there and get everybody to come see it in the big screen. And all the theaters, all the businesses that are opening up are establishing all these protocols. So, and I think one of the things at Santikos is they're only going to do 25% capacity. So they're keeping everybody distant, but a lot of people talked about it being on the big screen, and so I think it's kind of cool that they want to bring it back. Santikos got excited by all the vibe. But what we were able to do was, because of the pandemic and the fact that the theaters got shuttered, as an independent film, a lot of the theaters we were going to open were mom and pops across the country. So they were going to get hit hard. They weren't the big corporate AMCs and the big ones. So we decided that even though we were able to pivot onto an online platform fairly easy, and so that we could continue showing this film to our audience, we decided to share the revenue with these mom and pops. So we did not cut them out. We said, no, you're coming along with us. You were going to give us a run and give our little film a chance. So now if we sell that ticket and you send your people over to our site, then we're going to share that ticket with you. And we were able to keep a lot of those little theaters afloat, to the point that when everything shut down, we were the #1 box office film in the country for about 3 weeks.
Wow.
Because there was no theaters open. So by default, yeah, baby.
You're
and
part
I
of
believe
history now.
And I believe we were the lowest grossing #1 box office film ever in history. But out of that, we got a lot of good reviews, and as a matter of fact, I think a lot of people were able to see it, rather than if we had struggled to survive against the next superhero Marvel picture coming up, pushing up against us and getting us out of the theater. So we're going strong. We've been able to keep showing right up until we release on Monday digitally. So it's been a good thing.
And if people watch it at home, whatever it is, $5-7, you can get like 15. Well, you want to socially distance. You got 15 people in your family. You can all watch it for the same ticket price.
That's the beauty of it. You know, you can have watch parties, and you know, really kind of. I mean, and that's what we Latinos love. That whenever VHS came out, it was like people stopped going to the movie. It was like, yeah, we're gonna rent 6 videos, and we're gonna stay home and make sure everybody watches something.
Yes. So hey, you know,
a whole new distribution world.
Yeah. So tell us about how you got started, because the world knew you first in Fame, which was a huge hit. And so how old were you when that started? How did you get that role? And you know, and that was your first iconic role.
It was the job that got me into the industry, got me an agent, it got me a manager. It started me off. I was lucky enough, you know, usually as a young actor, when you get your first role, you know, you're playing a one-day character on a crime drama, and you're dead or you're in jail before the end of the episode, and that's it. You're back to being unemployed. But Fame, you know, was based on an Alan Parker film that came out in 1979 about School of Performing Arts High School, which is based in New York. And it was a great film, and it went through the 4 years of these young teenage kids struggling to be successful artists. And being a young Chicano artist myself, that film was like, wow, there's a high school where you can actually do what I like to do. And I don't have to be the oddball, you know, at Harlandale High School like I was, you know, the weirdo, the drama weirdos, right? The drama geeks. But so a lot of us absorbed that film and the energy of that. And we kind of got introduced to the idea of School of the Arts. And so I was lucky enough to get into the theater program at Incarnate Word College here in San Antonio. And they had a great theater program. Ronald Dibbs and Maureen Halligan were some incredible acting teachers and actors from the Dublin Players in Ireland. And the Sisters of Incarnate Word, who were friends of theirs, brought them to open an acting school. And that year they were opening a brand new theater that they had built, and Gregory Peck cut the ribbon. So I was a big movie fest. I was like, Gregory Peck's here in San Antonio? What? I can't believe it. Well, sure enough, they were looking for more Chicano kids to come into the program. So I had an upperclassman, Rene Rivera, good friend, great actor, and I looked up to him. So somehow or other, they asked him, hey, do you know any young Chicano students that would love to come to Incarnate Word? And I didn't have the grades and I didn't have the money, but they sent me a letter and said, hey, if you want to come to the theater program here. And it got me so acting got me into college. And I floundered for about 2 or 3 years where I kind of found my level. But at the same time, I grew in confidence, going to college. I tell a lot of kids, especially if they're going into the arts or media, I go, it's okay to go towards higher education because it's a safe place to ply your craft until you figure out how you're going to make it, where your niche is. And so I push higher education a lot, even as a successful artist, So from there, I auditioned for an acting program in Los Angeles or close to Los Angeles called California Institute of the Arts. And CalArts was famous because it was known as the Disney School. They had a big animation program. A lot of the Disney and the Pixar cats came out of there. I went to school with Andrew Stanton from Pixar, Don Cheadle. So a lot of these guys were my classmen at that time. Well, at that time, Fame was a television show. It had become a successful series, but it had gotten canceled by NBC. MGM, who were the producers of the film and the television show, they knew what they had because it had an international audience. It was successful, really successful. So they went into a 5-year syndication contract. We were the first film, because remember, syndication was usually reruns. So we were the first television show to be produced in syndication. But it was before cable, it was before, so we had to sell to affiliates. It wasn't a net, so we weren't seen across the country. My grandmother couldn't watch it here because in San Antonio, because we got canceled by Hee Haw. So, so my grandmother had to wait till 1 a.m. so that she could watch it out of Chicago on WGN to see her little mijito. So, but you know, my character was Jesse Velasquez. A lot of people thought he was Puerto Rican because he was from New York, but he was actually Mexican, and he was Mexican national. The storyline was that Jesse and his family were living in El Paso. They were from Juarez. The migra came and took them, and he escaped and made his way up to New York, and he was going to get through this school because he was going to become a star and bring his family back from Mexico.
That was
my backstory. I had to sing for my green card, bro. There's an episode where they catch me, the migra catches me in New York. They're trying to deport me. Nia Peoples tries to marry me before her parents say, dude, come on, you're too young to get married to him. All kinds of stuff happens. And finally, I sing for my supper. I sing to the immigration officer. He cries and he stamps my card.
Wow. For all of
you
you,
believe it. There's an episode on Fame. I think it's the first season maybe that I was on, which is 80. I came on in 84. So 84, 85, there's an episode out there where I have to sing for my green card.
So all of you who ever find yourself in that position, take a lesson from Jesse. Sing, it might work. It might work.
You better be good at something. Yeah. If only you could show your talent to be allowed to be part of this great country, then again, and isn't that the point, right? Bring me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, you're huddled masses yearning to be free. But the reality of it is we talk about the contribution to what's here, you know, but the reality of it is that a lot of our history is based on the conqueror. So Manifest Destiny taught that whoever wins the war, wins the battle, gets to tell the story. But when you do that, then you invalidate all of human history and what it takes to create our society. You know, it's a collection of successes and failures. So to invalidate someone's failure because their history doesn't jibe with your idea of manifest destiny, and I think that's our biggest problem with what's happening now in our country and in the world as well. Because if you look at the ills of all the governments, they're all going through the same thing. There are indigenous populations in Latin America. There are indigenous populations in Africa. There are indigenous populations in Europe. You know, you talk about immigrants, you talk about the Jewish culture and faith and how long their history is and what they had to go through during the World War II. But even beyond that, and again, just because their culture and their history was different than what the governments and the powers that be were at that time. So I think we constantly have to re-examine who we are as a people. And I think that's really what I take the responsibility on the most as an actor and as an artist of color, is not only the responsibility to be who I am and to celebrate that, but also to how can I tell these stories? How can I develop these narratives? Whether it's on stage, whether it's in film, whether it's in narrative, song, music. And I think all of that is important for us. I mean, look at what's been happening with this pandemic. Everything shuts down, and who are the people that are giving it away? The artists. You see all these incredible musicians and artists giving away something that they charge for, you know, but why? Because it's their gift, because they have nothing else to give and they want to do something good in the world. Actually, the Fame cast, a lot of us have been doing tours for the last 8-9 years. We've been doing European tours because the popularity is still so big in Europe. And we've been able to do it for nonprofits. We've been able to raise money for orphanages. And we just did a big reunion last year in the UK after about 30 years of the original cast having gone there and done a concert in London. So with this reunion, we were able to raise money for a place called Clare House, which is a children's hospice there in Liverpool. And oh my God, if you saw the type of love that came from the fans. But the thought when I'm on stage and I'm getting all of these accolades that it's for something bigger than ourselves, that's really where you appreciate what you can do and what your talent can give as an artist. And I think we need that right now. You know, Phoenix, Oregon, the fact that this film is doing so well at a time when everybody is getting such heavy information and energy from around the world, you know. So to be able to step aside for a second, to watch a film about people struggling to achieve their dreams and then friendship and family and love kind of uplifting them, and that choice to look around us and to see that we're surrounded by that. You know, the wonderful thing is that as much as we're social distancing, people are reaching out through these Zoom meetings, through these events. You know, Dreamocracy, the shows that you guys have been doing have been fabulous. But again, that type of artistic interaction is what people are appreciating right now. So for us as artists, it's the time when we come alive and when we celebrate, you know, what we need to do as a Dreamocracy to move forward, you know. So absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And here we have a picture of you from Fame. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh my God.
Yes, of the original.
Mm-hmm.
But no, you're right. And I think that that's one thing that's important, is because this question of what's an essential worker, you know, if you asked us, we were just talking about how we started these conversations 2 months ago. And, you know, we know that the redefinition of this experiment, this democracy, is necessary because of what we've seen in the Trump years, totally throwing out the Constitution, throwing out the rule of law, the checks and balances, all the stuff that we were taught was what made this country great. And they don't care. You know, people are committing crimes, they're lying to Congress, and they're being let go. So all these groups that are doing the Dreamocracy building, we knew that we had to talk to them, but we didn't know how much was going to change so fast. And if we had this conversation 2 months ago, you know, people would still be talking about, you know, how undocumented immigrants need to be put in cages, and you know artists are bums or whatever. But now they're the essential workers. You know, now people are realizing if you want food on your table, it's coming from the undocumented, you know, person.
And they're the frontliners. They're most at risk
right now.
Yeah, and they're frontliners. They're most at risk. So the people that we were denigrating a few months ago are now the ones that are at most at risk, and having to deal with keeping society going somehow or other. But that's always the case. I mean, even when this discussion comes up before the pandemic, that was always still our discussion. It's like, wait a minute, do you realize that what we're talking about is the idea of what human beings naturally do? We're nature, we're part of nature, we migrate, you know. In this landmass, especially when we're talking about our border, which is really where our discussion is centered, right? Especially being in Texas, being in California, being in the Southwest, that's the reality of us, and the fact that it's divided our culture for several centuries now. But the idea that this landmass has been traversed by natural elements, including human migration, for tens of thousands of years. So if you talk about, well, Native Americans came from Asia and Mongolia, they're not native to the American landmass. Well, yeah, but if you talk about the fact that they migrated over several 100,000 years over the Bering Strait and across, then you're still talking about thousands of years of traversing a landmass. So how can you at some point define, oh, well, you know what? After 250 years, this is the United States of America, and this is our history. Well, wait a minute. After 70,000 years, don't we get to talk about the cultures that were here for those 70,000 years? Monte Alban, you know, we're talking about the medicine wheel that has been here for 1,000 years. There's medicine wheel sites in the Americas that have been in existence for over before there were European ancestors. So that's over 500 years ago, if we follow our current history books, right? I can't even think 50 years pass, much less 100, much less 500 years. You know, a while back we were celebrating in 2018, we were celebrating the tricentennial here in San Antonio. So when I was doing a lot of autograph signings, and I would see some of these young kids and I was trying to convince them to go to college, you know, so I was spinning the blood in, blood out thing. Hey, Vatos Locos, go to college. Or, you know, if they knew some of my other projects, hey, try to get them into a higher education, read a book type of message, right? So at one point I kept asking them, I said, hey, so whenever they tell you in this whole immigration discussion and you get caught on the wrong side of it and people are telling you to go back to where you came from, what are we celebrating right now? Tricentennial in San Antonio. Okay, how much is 300 years? How old is the United States of America? Do the math. And so I kept telling them, do the math. So that tells you that even if you just relate yourself from your Hispanic heritage and the Spanish colonial, and you claim to be from Spain, the Canary Islanders and all that, okay, even if you define yourself from there, you're still older than our definition of the United States of America, which is still very Anglo-centric. It's still rooted in the 13 colonies, which is understood, but again, this is the new America, and the new America.
You work with AIT, with American Indians in Texas. Tell us about your native background.
I'm actually on the board of AIT SCM. So AIT stands for American Indians of Texas of the Spanish Colonial Missions. And AIT is responsible for a lot of the repatriation of any remains that are found at the missions, especially as they're being redefined and dug up as tourist sites and stuff like that. But AIT started its work about 35 years ago with a group of native Coahuiltecans. So the Coahuiltecan nation, the Coahuiltecos, are direct descendants of Texas tribes. A lot of different tribes, Coahuiltecos, Comecrudos, there's a lot of different tribes that are affiliated with Texas, the Carrizo, and so a lot of those tribes kind of, because they were Christianized, by the time the definition of North American Native Indian was created, which was in the early 1900s, right, or in the late 1800s, a lot of Texas Indians had lost their native culture. Remember that at one point, under law, European law, it was illegal to be indigenous and native. So if you did the customs, if you looked like, if you dressed like, if you spoke the language, then you were in danger of your life, you know, being incarcerated, all of this. So especially in Texas, Texas, we assimilated. We became Spanish citizens. The natives here and the mestizos, the mixture of the native and the Spanish, were the first Tejanos. So actually we defined the first Texans as a mixture of Native American, Spanish, and the first people that were here. So the Tejanos, I mean, Texas is a native word, right? So all of that to say that we come from those roots that are directly underneath us. They're our land, but the history's been cut out.
And the difference between, you know, California and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, you know, we all have the Spanish colonial history and the missions that were plopped in there. In California, you know, the missions, you know, we have that notion of, oh, Father Sarah, and everyone's happy, and look at the mission trail, but they were really brutal. And
very brutal. The mission system was very brutal.
The legacy today is that the California indigenous story has been basically wiped out. Even the Californio story has been kind of wiped out. You know,
we use the Californios as a piñata.
Yes.
Hey.
Yep. But in Texas, there's more of, you know, of a defiance of a survival. And you guys were Apache and other tribes that were much more, you know, Firme than our tribes were more peaceful in California. But, you know, the ability to maintain that dialogue, that representation, you know, and they were really out to exterminate the Apache, the Spaniards and the Americans.
And the Comanche.
Yeah.
and the Comanche who were coming down from the plain after they'd have, they'd mastered the horse.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is, and that's where my blood comes from. My blood comes from the Apaches. So we were the Mexican Tejas Apaches, There were rancherias right down here in the South. And that's where my grandmother, Mama Chana, great-great-grandmother comes from, through my mother's side. So that's the blood. But again, the Apaches, like all of the other different groups, mingled, and as the populations changed, and I think this is something that was different from the Spanish than the kind of the settlers that came later, is they were willing to live together with the native tribes. So there was a point where they said, you know what, we're not gonna exterminate them. So let's figure out how we can live together without all of this strife. So there was several times when there was peace between the colonial settlers, which had already been there for several hundred years, the missions, which is where a lot of the cities were across the Southwest, and the stronger native tribes who retained their strength, like the nomadic Apaches, the Comanches. And so there was kind of a coexistence there. But I think with the expansion of the nations, the American nations, with the strife between the French and the Spanish, the British, and the Americans had used the native tribes, and this is where Tecumseh comes in. The British and the Americans had used the tribes up in the east to fight their battles. So they were picking sides. And Tecumseh, actually, who you see there, Tecumseh was actually a British officer. He was actually commissioned as a British officer at one point in the
when you really look at the history and you dissect it and you don't buy into the official story, and I know there's a big battle, it's been going on for like 30 years, for keeping Chicanos and indigenous stories and African-American stories out of the textbooks so kids don't learn them in the first place. Mm-hmm. There's also
Arizona.
Yeah, there's also a fight back. And now California, Arizona, Texas, there have been some significant wins to put them back in. But I was just watching Tecumseh the other day. You can see it streaming, and you can buy the VHS, and maybe you can find it at the Pulga. But it's a really fascinating story because you're right. We're taught, there were the natives and then the Americans, and then they fought, and the natives were killed off. But there was a long period where the natives still had their land, still had their autonomy. We're making alliances with the French, like you said, and trying to negotiate with the Americans. But
and doesn't that go? That doesn't. I remember that all of that, and again, the struggle continues. I mean, that's one of the things that we do with AIT is we really, really work hard. We're in this program right now that's called Making the Invisible Visible, and it's talking about identifying indigenous urbanized tribes that have retained their sense of identity, but have become lost and invisible in the urban environment, but are still retaining that idea of who they are as a people. And so that's a beautiful thing, because that's what they accuse the Chicano culture of doing, and that's really what we've been able to do. If you can retain, and again, they accuse the Jewish culture of doing the same thing. You retain your culture in the face of the homogenization of what they want you to do. But realistically, beautiful American culture, I mean, you're talking about, if you really look at Anglo culture, if you look at Anglo-Saxon culture, if you look at where a lot of our American culture comes from, it's beautiful. And when you see those sources and you see how people bring those sources to who we are, that's what makes us beautiful. So I think that the struggle has continued from that time. In other words, they tried to exterminate us. They tried to wipe us out, and all they did was make us stronger. The oral tradition, as much as you tried to destroy the language, the first thing they would do when a tribe was under treaty, when they put them in reservations, right, when they removed them, was they would take all the kids and they would send them to those parochial schools, right? And that was the mission the whole thing, right? So again, indoctrination, right?
And there's some great new documentaries about those schools in the U.S. and Canada that talk about how brutal they are, all the abuse that went on, people dying and then being buried,
Well, it's kind of like prison, and it's kind of like, what's happening now on the border. They're not talking about that anymore because of what's happening. But remember that right before this, we had separated families. We were mistreating them by the way we were housing families and incarcerating them, right? Young kids, teenagers, youngsters, right? Old people. So we were doing this to them, and we had no facilities, no system for handling all of this. So we were basically incarcerating them as immigration criminals, border criminals, for the forgotten, right? Well, thousands of kids got lost. Well, we don't know where they went. Well, we don't know where they went. When you have that type of gut, racist reaction from the administration, and it filters down into these systems like, unfortunately, INS, unfortunately, ICE, unfortunately, the police. So on high, right, our leaders make these gut reactions, the evildoers of the world, and they look like this. And then it filters down to what's going on now. Because when people meet each other face to face and they have no compassion for each other, then all of a sudden they become fearful. And now all of a sudden it's very easy for someone with a gun to look at a family of Native Americans. Let's fast forward back to the 1800s. To look at a family of Native Americans, an old woman, an old man, some kids, and to say, we got to wipe them out because without them, there's no me. And that idea of us against them comes from our perception of who we are as a humanity.
And that's why it's so critical to be storytellers, to record,
yes,
to distribute that message.
Sharing stories is where we realize how universal we are.
Also to preserve just our indigenous heritage, because there's indigenous people in every continent and every nation on earth.
That's what I'm saying.
In Ireland, you have the Celts. You have the ancient Britons in Great Britain. In Spain, there's the Basques and and a lot of
the Iberians were Celts as well. The early Iberians
ties to the Stone Age, and to cave paintings.
We were all
in France,
tribal.
the Gauls. So there's indigenous legacies all over the globe, and as we corporatize and industrialize, it's often those self-sufficient autonomous communities that are displaced, that lose their land, lose their place in society. And now look, when the infrastructure breaks down as it has now, what's really helping us but folks that have retained the knowledge of how to live off the land, of how to survive. And that's why that tie to the land and that tie to our indigenous heritage is so important right now.
And I really believe that one of the keys to Dreamocracy is empathy. We've covered a lot in the different conversations, but that message that you were just talking about, that, you've got to hate the other person, they're a threat to you. If we can get people to just erase that programming, if we can jam that signal, like all the people that are out there, they're racist and they're losing their whiteness or whatever, they're afraid and they're scared. And if they got a message that, hey, we've been in the same boat of losing our culture for 500 years, we could be strong allies.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, welcome to the club. But instead, it's like, oh no, you like the South, right? Yeah, well then you like the Confederates, right? Yeah, well then you like the Nazis, right? No, I like Elvis. I like
exactly.
So, but if we could just like get everybody realizing that they're being oppressed by the same person, what we're seeing in Minneapolis,
perhaps consistent,
has deep roots. But you were telling me today that there was a scene in the news where
there was a line of Anglo protesters that had made a line in front of the African-American protesters to protect them against the police, because they knew the police would not hit white people. Yeah. So they actually formed a human shield line to protect their African-American community. And that's really beautiful when somebody can use their privilege like that in a way that brings equity. I think that was a very powerful. Please look it up. We'll see if we could find a link.
Tell us
that's what I love about like again, the European tours that we've been doing. You know, I get a chance to really get to meet some of my European fans, but man, the love that they show to a show that was basically one of the only multicultural shows on television. But the fact that people absorbed who we were as artists, and so whenever we do these concerts, we make sure and let them know that you're spreading that love. You know, I sang in Spanish for them. One of the songs from Fame, I translated it because I wanted them to know how proud I was of my Latino culture. I did a Native American dance before one of the other songs that I did for them because I wanted them to see where I came from, you know, my Apache roots. So, and they celebrate that. There's no other, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe that Jesse's sharing his other part, his otherness, what makes him who he is. And I think to see that lets me know what the world is really like. So whenever I see that other ugly side, I know that there's this other side that's with us. That line of people that was in front of those black protesters protecting them. You know, the people that marched, you know, you're talking about, remember in the 60s, that's what I loved about the activism, the social activism, is that even though you had your Chicano moratorium, you had your Chicano movement, you had your Freedom Black movement, you also had this big 60s hippie movement, counterculture revolution that was about, yes, peace and love. And even though it sounds all hippy dippy, ultimately that type of mentality, that openness of spirit is what we need to address these very grievous wrongs.
And that spirit is really alive today. When you look at the national movements, you know, we went to Washington, D.C. for the Women's March to End Family Separation. Totally multicultural, people from all over the country, all walks of life. That's what America looks like today. You know, America, the demographics are on our side. Latinos, we have to keep reminding ourselves, we're $1.7 trillion purchasing power. You know, we're like the biggest purchasing bloc. You know, statistically, you know, population size. You know, we've got to fill out the census. And if you want to put your Native American in there, do it, because I don't feel Caucasian, you know, keep redefining us, but you have to put yourself in the box that you want to belong in, and know that there are people standing up all over the country. The protests are huge, and there's so much positive. It's you know, gone off the rails so quickly with Trump. But I want to talk to you about Tecumseh, because like we said, yesterday was the 190th anniversary of the signing of the Indian Removal Act, and that's 1830. So Tecumseh's in the 1810s.
Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, Tecumseh's in the 1810s, and you know, we know that American democracy was founded on the Iroquois Confederacy, right? The Iroquois nations, and then Tecumseh was also a part of a confederacy of tribes that were trying to, you know, live in harmony. And it's a shame that we talk about racism today in the South, that the Confederates ripped them off too. You know, the Native Confederacies. Tell us about what you learned about Tecumseh. What inspired you most? What's the lesson that we can learn today that he had to say? Other than don't trust a white guy.
The beautiful thing about Tecumseh, right? Panther in the sky. Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader, right? And as one of the leaders, he was really an advocate for Native American social rights. So he was very well spoken. He was considered an incredible orator. Around the time of James Clay and those guys, you know, who could hold an audience spellbound. But he also never signed a treaty, and he was a historian. You know, Tecumseh knew his history, and not only that, but he knew Native history. So he would refer to the first meetings between the original English settlers and French settlers and the old tribes, the Pequot and the Iroquois and all of the original tribes, a lot of which were extinct by that time. Remember that by that point, you know, the Europeans had been in that area for a while. What was happening was the United States was trying to expand, right? They'd won the battle. They'd won their independence. It was shortly after 1776. And so in the late 1700s, which is when Tecumseh came into his own, and the early 1800s, the United States was trying to expand. But what was there? A bunch of people. Man, what are we going to do with those people? How do we get rid of them? So what they would do is they would push the boundaries. They had treaty boundaries. So what they would tell the settlers is, go grab land and we'll protect you, right? This was unspoken because it was illegal to squat on native land. So people would go, they'd go hunting, they'd settle, right? Like Ann Coulter said, I'm not an immigrant, I'm a settler. So she would go and settle where she wasn't supposed to. And then the trouble would start, right? And the trouble would be like, hey, what's going on? And usually it was, you saw a native, you would shoot them because they were scary, right? Tecumseh had a chip on his shoulder because his father had been killed by a white settler who he met in the woods. And he basically said hi to him, and the guy shot him and got scared. So Tecumseh always had it in his head that there's some sort of racism here that's not defined. But again, we didn't define racism at that time because Native Americans, as strange as Europeans were, we were all human beings. So we understood. So that understanding of everyone has a right to be here was part of Native philosophy. So what Tecumseh identified, I'm sorry, what's that?
To pick up on something you said earlier, because you just got me thinking, when we learned in American history, we learned kind of like what you said, Americans were expanding and they wanted more land and they went out. But the reality is by 1810, you've got over 100 years of genocide and murder going on. So when the Americans show up on your, or the British show up on your land.
Yes, but we had no, remember that we had no internet, no telephones, no telegraph. So any Native American past the Mississippi had never even seen white people.
Right. But I think they would have been
any natives below the Great Plains had never. So when Tecumseh was trying to form his confederacy, the biggest problem was that he was traveling to these tribes and going, look, here's what's happening. The American settlers are all getting together. They're getting their fires together. That's what they would call a territory or a state, right? They're building their fires. If we all get together and quit fighting each other and quit thinking that we're different tribes, then we'll have more people than they will because we're all over the place. But we have to quit defining ourselves as Miami, as Shawnee, as Pirandot. We have to all be like they are. We have to say we're Americans or we're British or we're whatever. That's what we have to do. So he was redefining the idea of how to define yourself as people. You know, and that was the biggest issue, is that people didn't believe that that was happening. And it wasn't a lot of times until they came knocking on your door and all of a sudden the settlers were in your backyard that you realized that it was time. But by then it was too late. You were isolated, you were alone. And remember that the nations at that time were growing in strength. Mm-hmm. You know, they had the backing of the royal monarchies behind them. Even the United States of America at that time of 13 colonies had agreements with major monarchies, the Spanish, you know, a lot of talk about Tejano history, right? Do you know that we saved do you know that Texas and San Antonio in particular, we saved the American Revolution?
How was that?
When they tell us to go back to where you came from, right, as either a Mexican, as Spaniard, or as Native American. So during the Battle of Valley Forge, right, the Americans were about to lose. They were frozen in, they were trapped by the British, and they were running out of food. They were boiling their shoes for the leather to make leather soup. That's how hungry they were.
Barbacoa and Big Red, right?
Barbacoa and Big Red, man, and no Big Red, frozen Big Red. So at that point, George Washington, you know, desperately wrote a letter to the King of Spain and said, look, you guys are fighting England as well. Help us out. We're dying here. So Galvez, right, that Galveston is named after, Galvez grabbed 1,000 head of longhorn cattle, man, and with several hundred Tejanos, sailed up the Mississippi to Valley Forge and brought them cattle and meat and supplies. So the Tejanos saved the American Revolution, and they were able to survive. So, and again, those stories have been erased from history because of the racial politics of our country, especially in a state like Texas. I'm constantly fighting revisionist Texas history. Talk about the disappearance of the natives in Texas. There's the disappearance of our presence at the Alamo.
Right.
One of the biggest battles that we define right now, AIT is fighting a big battle. Well, the council that created AIT, which is the Coahuiltecan Council, Tribal Council, they're fighting a battle against the government offices of Texas in order to participate in the telling of the story of what happened at Mission San Antonio de Valero, which is the real name of the Alamo. It's called Mission San Antonio de Valero. And we have relatives buried there. There were natives there. And 35 years ago when AIT was formed, it was formed because when they tried to protest the digging up of some bones that were found there as disrupting their ancestors, they were told, well, you can't be the descendants because, well, the people that were here, they're extinct, they disappeared. And so they were like, well, wait a minute, but my grandfather's been bringing me here for years to pray for relatives here, so I know that we've got relatives. Wait a minute. So they basically had to go back, and thank God for university records, but they went back to the University of Texas records, the archaeological records, and they were able to define, well, who are the people that were here? The Coahuiltecos, the Comecrudos, the Carrizos, the Apaches, la, 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 la. Then they said, okay, now let's go to the Catholic records. Thank God for the church, right? So for the first time, the church was helping us out. Mission kept all their records of their baptisms from the beginning of the missions. So all they had to do was correlate. This guy was baptized in 16 whatever, and in 1718, right, which is about the time that San Antonio got started. And he was 35 years old. Juan Macias was 35 years old. I wonder who he was before he was Juan Macias. Hello. He was Tamo, he was Coahuiltecan. He was native. When they showed the baptisms of the first children, well, at that time, the Canary Islanders hadn't arrived yet. So we know who the fathers probably were, but who were the mothers? Hello, if they're defined as people of the town, there were only soldiers and priests there in the missions. So who were the first Texans, Tejanos, of San Antonio, of Béjar de San Antonio de Béjar? They were indigenous. So our native roots. So then through all of this detective work, they were able to apply for recognition in the state of Texas. Took a long time. There was a lot of battles, and they had a lot of help from the Native American Church. So with all of that, they were able to get recognized by the state of Texas as the Coahuiltecan Nation. And from there, AIT then, which is the nonprofit, they were actually more involved with doing community service in the barrio, which is where our urban indigenous, us as Chicanos are. And so they were dealing with substance abuse, helping substance abusers, domestic abuse, definitely focusing on the family matters aspect of our culture, and then doing that healing through bringing back Native American healing rites, Native American rituals. And now AIT is actually involved in a Coahuiltecan language program. So right now they're bringing back, they're teaching it, and we've got a couple of PhDs that are on that. So between all of that, we've really grown strong, not only as an organization, but also as our culture, and we've got a lot of young people that have been brought up for about 20 years now, and they're having kids. So it's a very strong nation right now, but the organization American Indians of Texas is really involved in that battle with redefining what the Alamo is about. And again, the powers that be, which are corporate money-making powers, want to define the Alamo only by that specific battle. But the theory that I posit, and I'm telling you right here, is that Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie were speaking Spanish at the Alamo. Mm-hmm. And people go, why do you say that? And I go, well, first of all, it was the lingua franca of the region. San Antonio was not an Anglo town. It was a Spanish town. The mayor was Spanish. The population was Spanish. They were divided. There was as much, it was a Tejano battle. The Tejano battle for independence had been happening for 25 years, way before any of the Anglo settlers had arrived. When they came in, we were in our second phase, 14 years earlier in San Antonio, in our battle against, again, the forces of Mexico, which at that time were Spanish, were defined as Spanish. Santa Anna came in as a young colonel and wiped out all of the men of fighting age in San Antonio. It was a massacre. So 14 years later, we were barely getting our boots back on. And that's why when the new settlers came, we said, hey, you want to fight for Texas freedom? And they said, absolutely. The idea was wonderful. But where the disconnect happened is after we won our independence, the Tejanos got cut out for two reasons. One, they didn't want slavery because we were Spanish and we were Catholics. And two, we were Catholics. So people don't know that in the 1800s, there was a big Protestant Catholic uprising. And again, the same idea of defining the other, it was like, not only are they Mexicans, but they're Catholics.
And that's an important
there were several purges in San Antonio.
Yeah, that's an important lesson from history, because one of the strategies for populating the northern territories for Mexico in the Spain in the 1810s and Mexico in the 1820s was to bring in Catholics. And we're like, oh, you know what? If they're Catholics, they'll be more friendly to us. We'll bring in the Irish, the Germans. And that's what started happening. But then, like you said, the Protestants came in pretending to be Catholics, pretending to convert. But their whole plan was to take over and bring in slaves. And there were pro-democracy independence movements in Texas, in California, and in New Mexico in the 1820s. And one of the big unanswered questions of this continent is, what if those different republics had been, able to become independent and become their own republic? We had like 5 or 6 countries, doing their own thing with their own traditions, with their own people.
Be a lot more balanced.
A lot more balanced.
Yeah.
But an interesting story about the Texas quote unquote, founders is that when de Tocqueville was in the United States in 1831 and he took a steamboat down to New Orleans, he actually rode down with Sam Houston on the riverboat.
Real life.
And he was still the governor of wherever he was, Kentucky, wherever he was. And but it was before the Texas Revolution. And then they stopped. And a lot of natives, were being brought on to the boat that were being relocated. And de Tocqueville doesn't really write about it, but in his notes, he talked about how he was disgusted by it. He didn't really talk a lot about the South, but the one thing that he did say about the races on the continent was that he felt sorry for. He said there are 3 races on this continent. There's the Anglo, the African, and the Native. And he said the Anglo will not share this land with anybody. So there's only 2 fates: enslavement or elimination.
Or death. Yeah.
And he said, I feel sorry for the indigenous people because they're not going to allow themselves to be enslaved. And so they're going to die. And he knew this in 1830s, but it was all part of the plan already.
Yeah. And another fun fact about the Alamo, you heard that Davy Crockett, of course, didn't go down swinging a musket, that he was actually found hiding behind somebody's bed and wearing a hoop skirt and a bonnet because he was sneaking out dressed as a woman to get supplies or whatever, I guess.
Are you sure about that one,
Yeah,
Pocha?
it's at the University of Texas.
Wait, was that David Bowie or Jim Bowie?
It was Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett.
It was Davy Crockett.
The University of Texas has that.
The University of Texas. It's a part of the De La Peña manuscript.
Yeah.
Oh,
De
the De La Peña.
papers.
Yeah.
And that was one of the few eyewitness accounts of the Battle of the Alamo, and he actually cites about how Davy Crockett was found hiding in a woman's skirt and bonnet, which was like,
that was actually a real thing to get out of, like, to escape, because he would let the women and children out. It was a real
Yeah.
thing for the guys to dress up with women and try to sneak out.
Oh, yeah. It makes sense to me. If I were trying to sneak out, yep.
I
If I
need
were
to
trying to
go.
sneak out. There's also another hidden gem, you know, because his brother, I think, was part of the American government. You know, his brother, I think, was a senator or something like that. He was actually famous to the Mexicanos. So when they did capture him, which I did know, I don't know this, the De La Peña diaries tells you how they captured him. When they captured him, they took him to Mexico, and you know he was a person of renown. So they were trying to actually, his brother was trying to went back to the United States, which apparently had no involvement in Texas. Yeah, right. And he said, look, my brother was fighting for Texas independence. You know, he's in Mexico. Can we ransom him back? And they felt at that time that the whole idea of him dying at the Alamo as a hero was more important to the narrative, to the Anglo Manifest Destiny narrative, than ransoming him back and saying, oh, well, you know, he actually didn't die at the Alamo. So he wound up, I believe, spending 10 years in Mexico, and I think he died in a Mexican prison there, is the other side of that story. So, but you know, again, we're talking about revisionist history, and that's one of the reasons why I talk a lot about cultural narrative. When I teach these classes, when I talk to young people as filmmakers, my brother James Borrego is the new film teacher at SAC, right? And one of the, I drop in on a lot of his classes, but one of the things I talk to these young filmmakers about is something called cultural narrative. And cultural narrative is specific to who you are. But it's also an understanding of these unspoken stories, these unshared narratives. And I love all this stuff about these women-centric stories and what's going on, again, with what's happening with our humanity. The voices that haven't been heard, the silent voices. And so all of that I teach as the narrative of the cultura is important. You know, be proud of your raza, be proud of who you are. And that can be whoever you are and whatever raza you're from. So as an artist, to tell those stories, now you're breaking open the mold. Like just telling that story opens up the possibility for perceiving what may have really happened, you know, in those history-defining moments that only talk about one perspective.
And also point of view. Inviting people to make those same inquiries in their own communities, because it's all a history of deception, of you know, lies and manipulations. And you're right, the people that grab the land, they're going to retell the story to their benefit. But you know, speaking of pride in the raza and gems, we can't get out of here without talking about Blood In, Blood Out.
Oh my God.
Or Sangre por Sangre. Or I think in French it's like Les gens de la ville or something like that. Les gens
de la ville.
Kids of the street.
Really? Is that what it's called in French?
Les gens de la ville, yeah.
Yes.
And then in Italian it's Pacto de Sangue.
Oh, Pacto de Sangue.
Blood pact. Yup.
So you were telling me a few years ago, because I imagine a lot of people here are fans of Blood In, Blood Out, but you were telling me a couple of years ago that when you guys went to screen the film in Mexico, Sangre por Sangre, they were tripped out that there was an English version because you guys dubbed your own lines in Spanish, right?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to dub Crucito's voice. And
they knew it as a Mexican film, a Mexican story.
That's the whole thing, is if you watch it in Espanol, Sangre por Sangre, the voiceover is so good, the dub, that you get the feeling that it's a completely different film, even though it's exactly the same film, but in Spanish. But the phenomena that gente from Latin America, when they watch it, Mexicanos specifically, but I'm talking about Salvadoreños, gente from even Brazilians, bro, which speak Portuguese.
Bolivians too.
When people see it and they see it like that in their language, they think it's about them. They don't think it's about Chicanos. They think it's about a Mexicano who came up. They think it's about a Salvadoreño. They think it's their story. It's incredible. I watched it in Michoacan with some Perepucha Indians up in the hills of Michoacan. And I was amazed, and this was about a couple of years ago, I was amazed that they knew that film and it was theirs. They said, no, this is our movie. We can't believe that you're here. And so kind of the Chicano culture and the Chicano narrative is kind of a universal experience. And giving it to them in their language, which is our language, right? Kind of it reiterates that thing we talk about, that we're all one people, that root of who we are, that experience resonates throughout all of our differences and all our culturas, that the border is only in their mind because it doesn't mean anything when you're sharing that oral history, because that's what we did. We shared an oral history, we shared a visual history, and the raza from whatever part of Latino America, the raza from Kuwait, right? The Japoneses, the Japanese love it. They love Chicano car culture, but they love films like this. Mm-hmm. That sense of who we are as human beings and that struggle to be valid within a pinche war zone, like Jimmy Santiago Baca wrote, right? The incredible
and that prison experience, which is also, we talk about kind of imposed realities. The prison system is meant to throw us into it, and you've got
the incarceration of the human spirit. Yeah, think about it, and that was that's the basis for all our revolution. The American Revolution was based on the common sense idea, right, of Paine, of Thomas Paine, which was that every human being has inalienable human rights, that only God, the creator, the up above, the everythingness, that only that spirit can change that.
Yeah.
And under that, no king, no leader, no person, no culture, no police officer, no policing authority power can tell you what to do beyond your inalienable human rights. The right and the pursuit of love, life, and happiness.
We remember Raul Salinas, who wrote about the prison experience.
Incredible poet,
really,
the mind prison.
Inspiration to the mind prison, trip to the mind jail. But just you're right, that dignity, that you have to maintain when you go through that. Do you want to share a story because I know there's a lot of fans out there. Do you want to share a story from the production?
Blood In, Blood Out?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things was when I get a role, I try to right away see what's not being said. What are we missing, right? And here we had a story that even though it was about the rise of Chicano gang in prison, right? Basically an analogy of La M, right? Or other gangs like that, Nuestra Familia. There's a whole bunch of them that are kind of, that's analogous to this story. It also talks about these three brothers, right? And the relationship and how they each deal with the pressure cooker of an urban society like East LA in the 70s, right? Where you had exactly what's happening now. You've got, police brutality, you've got, cultural subversion, right? You've got economic stress, right? You're a stranger in your own land. Think about Los Angeles. Los Angeles was a Mexican town during the time of Joaquin Murrieta. It was a California estado long before it was a California territory. And that's the whole story of Zorro. The whole story of Zorro comes from Joaquin Murrieta, being a Robin Hood, a Zorro for his population that was being abused, So again, you have that idea of having to be macho just to survive, and the Benjamin Bratt character, Paco, takes it all the way to being the baddest Chicano in the barrio. The kid who learns from him and wants to be him winds up becoming the head of the Mexican mafia, the uber macho clan. And I'm stuck in the middle as the Chicano artist. So even though I was down, even though I was clicking, there was a different representation there of Chicano youth. Talk about Luis Rodriguez, who wrote Always Running, right? Luis Rodriguez, Tia Chucha's, what is it, Tia Chucha's cafe?
Sylmar, yeah.
Yeah, in Sylmar. Wonderful place for Chicano artists to get together. But Luis Rodriguez wrote a book called Always Running. And from there, he went and got his PhD as to why there's gang banging. Why do little Chicanitos gang bang? Why are there, little youth gangs? And not only Chicanos, but, young black youth are dying in the streets. What is the gang phenomena? Well, one of the things he found out was, first of all, gangs didn't start with Chicanos or with African Americans or with Asians. Gangs started with the Irish during the industrial era. It's an urban phenomena, right? But the phenomena is what happens in an urban environment, which you're very close to an affluent society, a dominant culture that denigrates and pushes down, enslaves, basically, urban enslavement enslaves the working class culture, right? And within that culture, you breed all of the ills, domestic abuse, the whole idea of Irish being drunks. Well, yeah, man, you're going to stick them all together and you're going to abuse them and you're going to put them in factories. They're going to start drinking. Same thing with Native Americans. First thing they did to us when they put us on reservations is they gave us liquor because they knew it would destroy not only our bodies, right, trying to genocide us out, but also would destroy our spirit. So that idea is what happens to a Mexican American culture, to any type of culture that's oppressed in a barrio, in a ghetto, whatever. So now it brings rise to this idea of kill or be killed, these corporate slogans. So that's the other thing that Luis Rodriguez found out, that these young Chicanitos take on these commercial dominant culture ideas, kill or be killed, the best is number one, a dog-eat-dog world. But they don't realize that those are commercial slogans in the clean white world. In the dirty brown world, they become very real, especially when you throw drugs in there, drug dealing, the whole idea of violence, the
And
whole
also,
idea
when
of
you talk
clicking.
when you talk about survival, like to run a gang or to be a drug dealer or whatever, takes a lot of business skills, leadership skills, motivational skills.
Oh, these homies in the barrio are incredible,
They're
man.
smart, yeah, but that's the
Yes.
only avenue that's available to them.
And then you talk
They had
about
other avenues, they would excel in that too.
And again, the problem is then if you don't capture them at that point and try to do something positive, which, forgive me, but that's not the goal of law enforcement in those neighborhoods. We get rid of the social programs and all we have is us against them. So now you criminalize these youngsters, and before you know it, now they're introduced into the prison system, which is they become career criminals. And that's when they become the adults that then become part of the bigger cliques, that become the drug dealers, they become institutionalized, and they become, they suffer from PTSD as well.
Yeah.
There's a whole study that was done that people that have gone through the prison system, that have gone through gangbanging, that a lot of them are suffering from PTSD as well. That it's not.
And there's generational trauma. We've talked in these conversations about genetic trauma.
Yeah.
That if your grandparents were abused, that your bones remember that, your genetics remember that, and then you have there's studies that say that that's really happens.
So you're much more prone to get into that culture, which is a culture. But again, when you look at it, the culture is really one of a subculture trying to find some sort of identity,
Right.
And that was the other thing, was that these little cliques were not necessarily violent. That was the main thing that Luis, and again, I'm leading this all back to what I was going to do in Blood In, Blood Out, right? So I saw this gang story. I saw that the prison story was about Miklo more than anything else. So I knew that was beyond what I was going to do with my character, right? Other than Miklo coming out. I had to deal with drug addiction, substance abuse, what that does, the wasting of a talented individual in this culture due to the street violence and substance abuse, that's directly related to my family, and what I had to go through. Very talented individuals wound up in prison, even though they were musicians, even though they were artists, they did time, they had to suffer with heroin addiction. So that was what I was going to put into my character. But I felt there was something else that was missing, right? Benjamin Bratt's Paco character was going to deal with a Chicano who has to separate himself from the street culture in order to be able to move on in his life. And then that puts him against his street culture. you know, so he becomes that idea of a vendido, you know. And so how do you deal with that separation, right? So we had all of our different storylines, but I really felt that something was missing in the young storyline. And the thing that was missing was what Luis Rodriguez found out, which was that if you look at young youth gangs, and I'm talking about the ones that we say are the, you know, what's her name, Clinton call them, Hillary Clinton? She called them the predators, or what did she call them? That was about the time that they started charging these young gang kids with adult, right. They were charging them with adult sentences and stuff like that. But the idea that they're all on drugs, they're all murderers, they're all, okay, that's going on. But if you study the clique, you'll see that there is about 15% that are violent and pathological. They got problems, yeah. Mm-hmm. The other 80, 75%, they're related to these guys. They just want to hang out. Girls, young gang members are very popular with the girls, right? Because they're the coolest kids in the barrio, right?
Right.
And a lot of times they just want to hang out and represent their neighborhood.
And also another thing that
they're not violent. They're not dangerous criminals.
And another
like
thing that we need to understand is like the way the idea of a gang is presented, mediated to us, right? When we think of New York gangs, in the 50s to the 90s, we thought of the Jets and the Sharks, right? Mm-hmm. And then Gangs of New York came out, and it's like, oh my God, that goes back 100 years, mm-hmm. you know. But one thing, whether it's the West Side Story or the Zoot Suit Story, is that we also remember that these are kids. Like the kids in the Sleepy Lagoon case were teenagers. They weren't 30-year-olds and whatever. So in addition to everything that you said, they're neighborhood groups that form that, you know, up until recently, now they're professionals, but the history is that they're just neighbors that come together to protect and defend themselves. And the fights happen when someone hurts one of your guys, you go hurt one of them.
That was the perception. You protect the barrio, you protect the barrio, you protect your hood, you protect your people.
But you think again, about it,
this is a phenomenon that you said. It's like a 20th century phenomena that got brought across from all of the stuff that had happened in the Southwest. You know, it's a history of oppression.
Yes.
From the very first, mission that was built. So now every new group came in and oppressed the group before it.
Right.
And so now the end game is that the population then is traumatized. So now you have the bedrock and then this is what happened in the 60s and 70s, is they introduced heroin. Then in the 80s, they introduced coke and crack. In the 90s. Now all of that ramped up what was already there, the violence. Now all of a sudden you have guns and you have assault weapons in the 80s, you know, colors, all of those. That's kind of where you started to see where Blood In, Blood Out was talking about the ramping up of what was happening. And it wasn't exclusive to just us. The perception is, oh, it's these evil people that all of a sudden decided they were going to create a Legion of Doom. No, all of that was being fed by the politics of the country, by the continued oppression of our cultura in our neighborhoods.
Can't forget the CIA.
Hello, and the constant oppression of what was happening to control the Latino population.
And one thing that you said earlier is really, really true, is that those are corporate wars. They're not really racial wars. They're not wars about settling, you know, scores.
The real war is the green on the human being. Mm-hmm. That is the real war. And if we realized that, we would get together in so many different ways, because we'd realize that we're not green. We're not made of that money. We're not made of that idea. You know, Tecumseh, going back to Tecumseh, the reason they hated Tecumseh is because when he spoke to Governor William Henry Harrison, who wound up becoming our shortest tenured president because he was such a blowhard, he gave a 3-hour, like Trump, he gave a 3-hour inauguration speech, and it was raining, and he caught the flu and died, pendejo. But he was a big Native American hater. So he was always pushing the boundaries. He was always causing wars with the natives. But he hated Tecumseh because in one of their classic meetings and one of their classic talking circles, he told him about American history, you know, and William Henry Harrison couldn't believe that a native was telling him about his own history, but it was from his perspective. It wasn't from the American powerful manifest destiny perspective. It was from the perspective of, you want me to sign a treaty with you, but when you signed a treaty with the Pequot, when you signed a treaty with the Narragansett, where are they now? They're gone. They're extinct. What did you do when and he started making a list of 200 years of dealing with the Native American cultures. Not only that, but he said, you will destroy your own God, talking about the crucifixion of Christ, right? He goes, you destroy your own God. And these are Tecumseh's exact words. He goes, you destroy your own God and then persecute others for not believing in him. What kind of people are you? So this idea of where he was taking the idea of, you know, your beliefs and going, okay, you believe this, and yet this is who you are. This is how you act. We cannot believe you, so therefore we can't sign a treaty.
And you know what? One of the consistent through lines of the injustice that we're seeing is this hypocrisy, right? And one of the kind of tools of hypocrisy is you have to throw the hypocrisy back at them because they don't have a defense for it.
Well, because it doesn't make sense. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, when do you see Trump lose it? When do you see him lose it? When a reporter repeats exactly what he said with a question mark. When a reporter repeats exactly what he says with a question mark, he loses it. Have you noticed that?
He walks out,
Hey, dude, it's a trip. He's going along really good. The minute they ask him the exact same thing he said, but in the form of a question, se le va la onda, dude, he can't handle it. It's like, but that's exactly when you look at, if you ever watch the film, and you guys watch Tecumseh, because I was able to put a lot of Tecumseh speeches into the TV dialogue. Because when I first got the script, it was a lot of ugh and how. And I started reading about Tecumseh, and I go, man, this guy's historical, man. Yeah. So I started taking his speeches, and I started wedging them into the television dialogue without the producers knowing, because I knew the writer was going to say, hey, huela fria. But I was like, no, man, you got to put some of his real stuff, because he's talking about real things, you know. And what he's saying to the Americans is exactly the difference. What he was showing is there's a difference in the way we think, bro. We think we're all one people. Even you're us. You deserve to be here under God. But you think that you are supposed to own everything. They said ownership. We don't believe in ownership. Own the land? That's the same as owning the sky or owning the water. Well, what do we have now? Now we have ocean space, right? Now we have airspace. Now we're selling planets, dude. So Tecumseh knew what he was talking about. He was like, you guys are crazy. How can you sell Jupiter? How can you sell space on Mars? Yeah. But that whole idea of possession was an alien idea to our indigenous culture. And
because
now
they were sharing resources. They were
now you see as human beings, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, man. You can't have rich people and poor people. It don't work.
I want to get to Q&A because I know that you have a lot of fans out there. But I want to go through a couple of films that you've gone through, just mentioning them. This, if you see this background, there's Mi Vida Loca.
Salma Hayek's first movie. That's Salma right there.
And a very iconic role.
Did you ever see the one that she directed that I was in, Maldonado Miracle?
No.
Salma Hayek directed a film that starred Peter Fonda, Ruben Blades, myself, but it's called The Maldonado Miracle. It's good.
So look for Maldonado Miracle. And here you are in VIDA, which is really popular right now.
Mm-hmm.
In VIDA.
Good show on Stars. Yeah, it's getting a lot of good. It's had 3 successful seasons.
As the dad.
As the dad. And also, this one you can't see, it says Vatos Locos Vote. You got that
Vatos Locos Vote. Yes, voting is so important. At this time, I think we were dealing with the. It wasn't the president. Was it the presidential election? No, I think it was a presidential election. And I was working on Good Behavior, which is a show on Showtime, I think. Matter of fact, I was doing my best Manu Ginobili because we were an Argentine family, and so I said, "Man, I got to do a good Argentine accent." So I was listening to a lot of Manu Ginobili interviews. But we really wanted my Latino blood in, blood out fans to get out and vote, because as Latinos, we're a very strong voting bloc. So it doesn't matter what you vote for, it matters that you vote. So we did a little, with David Reyes and Brown Bag Entertainment, we did a little hashtag Vatos Locos Vote and put it out there on Facebook, just trying to make sure that people know the voting was important.
And there it is right there, Vatos Locos Vote.
Vatos Locos Vote.
So I was really rooting for Castro. I donated to his campaign and everything, first time I've done that. But I was really sad that Julian Castro, I think he would have been great. He had a lot of great vision. And Joaquin is still running, so support Joaquin. But, we're really excited because, when you see somebody that represents you, you're like, yeah, I want that. That's what I want, And now what we're being offered is kind of like
the dream come true. His mom made the best tamales.
Yeah, but now it's all watered down. You have to settle between the lesser of two, evils or whatever. But there were a lot of great ideas in this election at the onset. There was diversity. There was different visions. There were women running.
Multiculturalism.
LGBT candidate. So, what do you think about this cycle? Because we want to turn Texas blue. So what advice would you give people to help turn Texas blue? Because there's a lot of small counties that make it look red. Big cities are already blue. How do we turn those small counties blue? What can everybody listening in today do to help turn Texas blue?
I think we got to deal with the issue of gerrymandering, dude. I mean, it's historical, and I think in Texas it's worked to their advantage, because the northern part of the country, where we're really divided, right, which is really where a lot of the red comes from, is gerrymandered. And there's the population in the South, which is primarily Latinos and will go blue. And San Antonio is you got the capital, which is very open-minded, even though it's the capital. But south of that, South Texas, and what you have the changing idea of who we are as a state and as a state culture, we should be blue already. And that's the problem, is that gerrymandering is a way for them to redistrict everything, and they've been doing it for decades, man. They've been doing it for elections.
Centuries.
So I think they've been doing it for centuries. So we have to find a way. And again, that's the problem with the Electoral College. That's the problem with a lot of the voting and the way it's done. You're talking about what we went through in 2001 with the hanging chads, what we went through the last election, with half of it being with the weird voting machines, going hinky. There's way too much manipulation. I mean, this last thing with the whole Russian interference, how are we allowing this to mess with the most important function of who we are as American citizens, man? The ability to be able to choose that person that's up there leading us. But again, that person leading us should not have that type of executive power. It's in the government not to have that type of executive power. So we somehow or other, and again, it's all in the gerrymandering, because we didn't let this happen. We blame the people. Oh, we didn't vote. Oh, you voted for Nader instead of what's his name. Oh, you didn't. Yeah, all part of that is true, but a lot of it is true that there's a lot of manipulation happening at the inside level. There's a lot of insider trading going on. I mean, look at all this stuff with the pandemic, that they busted all these senators, insider trading. So you're telling me that doesn't go on when they're trying to figure out who's going to be the next president?
Right, and Trump
that's BS, man. That's BS.
Yeah, and
so until we deal exactly with what's going on behind those closed doors, and again, remember that was a lot of the last issue with the election, is we were trying to say, hey, we got to peel it all back and see what's going on, because there's way too many backdoor deals being made.
Yeah, and Trump
put a dude in office who did nothing. He's doing backdoor deals with the big boys in other countries.
Yeah, and he's basically said that if
we can
make elections more fair, that the Republicans won't win. So they know it. They know the numbers are not on their side.
Hey, how brilliant, right? The last thing he was saying right at the end, when we still didn't know which way it was going to go, was he kept going, look, if Hillary wins, it's rigged. He kept saying that over and over and over. And I said, wow, that's great. So that's how you make sure that if you win, they think it's not rigged. See? Because I kept saying, well, wait a minute. So then if you win, does that mean it's not rigged? Is that what you're trying to say? It's exactly
If you look back, what he actually said was the election is rigged. I'm certain of it. So when he won, he basically
that's what I said.
Rigged. Yeah, he's basically admitted it.
So
but hey, I want to get to some,
it's not rigged. Wait a minute, man.
I want to get to some Q&A now. So I know you got fans out there.
Unmute everyone.
But as an artist and as an activist, we know that we're pretty much, we say it's all rigged, man. So
let's unrig it.
The whole thing with Phoenix, Oregon going on an online platform is the idea that when you make an independent film, it's already rigged. You're not going to win an Academy Award because it's already rigged. So when you're dealing with the powers that be, the idea of that it's rigged is always there in our minds, Yeah. But, that's why they didn't like the Native Americans, because the Native Americans saw right through it and they made fun of them. So they said, really? You guys are like that? Did you ever see The New World with, it's what's his name's film of Pocahontas, New World with Colin
No, I didn't
Farrell.
see that when I wanted to, but I saw Cabeza de Vaca when it came out. There's all these alternative histories. The Mission with Robert De Niro.
Yes.
But not The New World. But no, there's some really great films to see out there, but mainly yours. And,
but it talks up. Well, that one is one of mine. I'm one of the natives.
Oh, you're in it?
That meet what is it? John Smith. Was it John Smith that fell in love with Pocahontas, or who was it? Miles Standish, or who was the guy? Well, one of those guys. And it talks about, again, the failure of the original colonies and the fact that natives, who were the population, basically had to go save them. So you talk about, the early colonies, Roanoke, Virginiatown, Jamestown, and the fact that they would not have survived if it hadn't been for, well, Roanoke didn't survive, but Jamestown survived because Pocahontas people.
And the New World was a Terrence Malick film with Colin Farrell and
Terrence
Lubeski.
Malick, man. Terrence Malick's from Texas. So
and
Terrence Malick,
the cinematography.
What's Terrence Malick? Thin Red Line, some heavy stuff, right? Terrence
really
makes one
stuff.
movie every 15. Yeah.
So we've got some people here, and then raise your hand if you have a question for Jesse. We'll unmute you. So who has a question?
Raise your hand.
Oh, Bethany?
Moving.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, did you raise your hand? Do you have a question?
Hi, Jesse.
Hey, Bethany.
How are you? Hey, look, I want to show you something real quick. Look what I found.
Oh, that was my character's name in Fame, Jessie. So she had a fan group called Jessie's Girls.
True story.
And I got to meet her and some of the members of Jessie's Girls.
There were just two of us, and Sarah's here tonight too.
Sarah's here. Are you serious? You go, girl. So I got two Jessie's Girls out there. Right on.
All right. Sarah, did you want to say anything? I'm trying to unmute you here. Did you want to say anything, Sarah?
You're on.
No, you're good? Okay, Abigail, did you have your hand up?
Oh,
Oh, sorry. You got to unmute. Sorry, I just remuted you. There you go.
okay. Well, first of all, I've been re-watching a lot of the Fame episodes, and I would say that I'm a third Jesse's Girl. Because, I have to say, what was your favorite episode of Fame?
There was two of them. One of them was that episode where I had to sing for my green card because I got to represent a very real experience of my culture in American television. So that was fabulous. And I got to sing.
You have a beautiful voice.
Oh, thank you, love. And then the other one was an episode where I sang The Other Side of the Road, which is a song that apparently my grandfather had written. And I remember when I was singing the song, and there's a beautiful shot of me with the Statue of Liberty behind and a big ship is passing. We were out by the harbor when I sang the song on stage. And I just remember thinking of my real grandfather, Benito Cardenas, who was back here in San Antonio, and really kind of trying to channel that being proud of who he was. And so I think those were two of my favorite episodes. And then I have one more favorite one was one where I sang with Janet, right? Two to the Power of Love, which is the first time they introduced the Janet character, Cleo. And then the final episode of Fame where everybody came back, because I'd never met a lot of the original Fame cast. So there's where I got to meet Lee Carreri, Lori, Erica Gimble. So a lot of them I hadn't ever met. So it was great to have them all come back and be there with the new Fame cast. So that was the final episode, Remember My Name. So
yeah, and
my favorites.
well, I have several favorite episodes of Fame. It was episode the sixth episode Savage Streets.
Savage Streets, yes.
And that made me think, man, was that a form of peer pressure? Because the whole episode, the Ravens were trying to get your character to join the.
Absolutely. Again, that was exactly about an experience that a young Latino would have in an urban environment. The pressure to join a gang, the pressure to commit violence on another young gang member. Guess who, guys, guess who the gang member was that was trying to jump me into the gang?
Benjamin Bratt. No.
Isai Morales from La Bamba. He had just done Bad Boys with Sean Penn. And so he was, and that's where me and Isai Morales became good friends on that episode of Fame, Savage Streets. But also, Nia sang in that incredible song, Back on the Savage Streets. Ooh.
Yeah. And also, the scene where you're getting initiated into the gang, I just hope that you don't have a permanent scar from that knife, do you? And I hope that they paid you.
It was retractable. It was a retractable knife.
But Savage Streets, look for it on YouTube. Is it on YouTube? Can you find that?
I think so, probably. Yeah, Savage Streets.
All of the episodes are on Facebook, and I've actually been having several watch parties with a friend of mine, and we've sort of developed a Fame watch party group, which is great.
Well, that was my film with Isai Morales, who's now the new villain on Mission Impossible. Isai Morales, yes. So watch the new Mission Impossible movies. He's going to be the new bad guy.
Oh, and my other favorite episode is Double Exposure, where it's where you were trying to audition for the role of Jekyll and Hyde.
Oh, and I become Jekyll and Hyde, right?
Yeah, and I thought that you were great in that, and I was like, well, that is kind of creepy, but in a cool way.
Yes. The cool thing about that one was the makeup that we had to do to make me into Hyde. And the guy who directed that one, I had some great directors on Fame. Bill Duke. You guys remember Bill Duke? Remember Car Wash? He was the Muslim in Car Wash. He was also in Predator. Remember? He was one of the guys in the original Predator. Bill Duke. Well, he was directing by that point. So I got to work with some great people. And the great thing about television show Fame, I mean, I did over 66 episodes in 3 years. So I got to work with some great directors, some great actors, first timers, working with Debbie Allen. Did you ever see the live concerts that we did? Heart of Rock and Roll. We did the first episodes that I did on Fame weren't in the school. They were on stage in a live concert called Heart of Rock and Roll, Part 1 and Part 2. It's a two-parter. Mm. And I actually sing When Doves Cry by Prince as one of my songs on that one.
Wow.
We do a bunch of, it was the crazy 80s, Wow. But check out Heart of Rock and Roll, Part 1 and Part 2 is a two-parter. But It was the whole cast, and that's where they introduced me, Nia, and Janet as the new cast members.
Wow. So more questions. Darlene, do you have a question? Okay, I'm going to unmute you. Go for it.
Bye, Abigail. I love you.
Bye. Great to meet you.
Okay.
Hi.
That's Sarah. Y'all got a new Jesse's girl.
Hi, I am from Harlandale District 2.
Whee!
And I wanted to ask you a question. How did you feel when your dreams were accomplished?
Well, the good thing, Mija, is that as a human being, as a living spirit, you're always dreaming. You know, the dream world is all around us. So your dreams don't necessarily come true, you manifest them. So I think for me, it's always when I look back that I realize that my dream came true, because I try to live in the moment right now. And I think that's the way to make your dreams come true. Because if you're always thinking, when is my dream going to come true? It's like it's over the horizon. And if you live in the moment, you appreciate, you know, your loved families around you. You appreciate the love that you have. You appreciate the simple things, right? Like who you are. That's a beautiful thing, to appreciate who you. Every morning you look at yourself in the mirror and you go, you know what? No matter what the world thinks, I feel good. I'm going to be a better person, and I'm going to treat everybody else like they're a better person too. When you do that, you're creating that dream world around you. And the good things that you dream about, that's when it comes true. But you don't even realize it because you're happy. You don't realize it until you look back. Then you see, oh, wow, I always wanted to do that and I did it. You know, like inspiring you. I always dreamed about that when I was young, that someday somebody would look up to me from my barrio, right, from Harlandale, and say, wow, I can make it too. If he can make it, then I can make it too. And he's right from where I'm from. So that to me is a dream come true. But I try to appreciate it in the moment when it's happening, you know, and the dream continues. You know, I'm still trying to create that dream world so that when you get bigger, you don't have to go through some of the things that we go through right now, you know. So the strength is in you. It's in my daughter. It's in our youth. It's in the familia, right? It's in your cultura. So all of that just to say that dreams are manifesting right now as we're talking about them. Good question, Mija. Believe in your dreams. And watch my new movie, Phoenix, Oregon. She'll like it. It's good. I play a pizza chef. No, I don't know how to make pizzas. I don't know how to paint. I don't know how to do any of the things that you see in the movies.
I used to.
And go to college.
Hi. Hey, Jesse.
Hey, Miss Vicky.
Sweetie. Would you share with us your thoughts on the new-ish shows that are streaming right now, being Gentified, On My Block, and of course VIDA. On My Block deals a lot with gangs, whereas Gentified and VIDA deals with gentrification. And do you think that gentrification is the new colonization of our people? And just give me some thoughts on that, because we don't want to lose our cultura, but at the same time, we do want to help people to uplift their neighborhoods. So it can be a very slippery slope. Mm-hmm. And you know, if you're living on the near south side, I've seen that firsthand. Being the president for our neighborhood association, having businesses that want to come in and welcome people to help again elevate the neighborhood, but at the same time, we don't want them to be taking away our cultura. And it's really hard once you open that door a little bit to like keep control of it.
Well, talk about an indigenous. Well, first, let me hit up the first part of that, which is it's exciting as an actor, and you know this from having, you know, known me intimately as an artist as well as a human being, that for years I spend much time not working because the shows on TV do not have any positive Latino representations. So when I see another Narcos Corridos, when I see another, you know, series spin-off that has to deal with the darker side of our urban experience, which is how we've been defined in American cinema. I hate to say it, right? Originally, we were in the Westerns and we were the bandidos or the hostile Indians, right? Or the pobrecitos, right? The poblanos, right? So Then as American cinema in its last 100 years kind of got through the 50s and 60s, then we became the urban blight, right? And then and we became the other, right? The poor immigrant or the illegal immigrant coming across. And then in the 70s and the 80s, and the perception of that as culture, we became the dark part of the detective story, right? Which is a predominant genre form in American television. So as a young actor coming off of fame, as a dancing Mexicano who was able to sing for his green card, my next few auditions were puros gang members and la 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 and all of this. And I was lucky enough to get involved with Blood In, Blood Out, which even though it dealt with that subject matter, I was a Chicano artist and it was a much bigger picture and it was American cinema. So I was able to influence the story in some way, even though to me the perspective was still basically the same. After that, it was nothing. Other than Selena, other than Lone Star, every once in a while something would come out. I got more involved with developing independent voices and independent cinema. I got involved with a lot of Chicano filmmakers that came out of UT, Laura Varela, James Borrego, Fernando Cano, and they were all rooted in Texas. So we tried to kind of create that movement here in Texas at the same time that was happening in California. All of that to say that it took about 20, 25 years for those voices to simmer through and eventually became the kind of, fertile landscape that there is. Again, you still see that the perspective is still kind of skewed towards half this and half that. When you give people like Tanya Saracho, who's the show writer, runner, creator, and comes from South Texas, a chance to control the narrative, now you get something that's a little more all-inclusive like VIDA, right? That not only deals with not only gentrification, but also deals with our idea of gender identity within our own cultura, which is a very, supposedly taboo topic. And yet, when I came out with the film, when Peter Bratt came out with the Benjamin Bratt film La Misión, which dealt with a homosexual son in a lowrider family, the perception was that the Latino audience was not going to, relate to that. They loved the film because, again, within a narrative, within an oral sharing of artistry, you work those things out. And now you can deal with those difficult discussions. So I think that something like Vida and Gentified can create those dialogues, specifically when we're talking about that issue. Now, that's what's happening. So I'm excited that that's happening. Hopefully Hollywood will quit writing that tired old narrative, that perspective of who we are as Latinos. I'd like to see that happen with what's happening on the border, that tired old narrative of the other versus, American manifest destiny. We have to change that. But again, until we're the ones that are writing that narrative, I'm always challenged by my agents in representation because they're saying, well, what if this is the only thing that's being written? And I say, look, I don't have a problem talking about narcos or what happens to gente in that situation or what's happening on the border, or there's shady characters on either side of the story. But the perspective comes from a very, very specific cultural perspective. If it comes from my perspective, then we're going to talk about why is it like this? Why is American policy creating this? What is the years of banana republics and support of those banana republics that have caused countries like Colombia to run drugs? What about the CIA's involvement in all of this over decades? I saw this documentary called America on Drugs, and it went through 50 years of different drug wars and what we call the drug war. Well, one of the things I learned was that every American president knew what was happening, and that we were intimately involved in supporting these drug movements. So on the one hand, we supported them, and then they became our bad guys for this ramp up of a drug war, which was really an attack on Latin American populations and control of those areas. And we supported Pinochet's. We supported those regimes that created the problems that we're dealing with now. So unless you understand history, then you don't understand why Blood In, Blood Out, those characters were there to begin with. If you really look at the story of why that particular group was able to have a rise of power in prison, was because in the 70s, there was a lot of government money funneling into the neighborhoods to help the drug addicts. Well, these government entities and a lot of the go-betweens were in cahoots with a lot of this money, and it was funneling back and forth into illegal areas. So now you have a situation where it's all corrupt. And where does it land? On the civilian population that's now all of a sudden involved with drug addiction, crack, the ramp up of the gangs, because now they have power, now they have money to buy guns, and you're seeing Uzis, but nobody connects the dots, and it's like we're living in isolation from each other. So if you learn these things, then as a storyteller like me, then you can put them into the narrative and represent. I think that's what's happening with Gentified, with Vida, and I think if we're able to control the narrative, then you'll have stories that really talk about what's really happening. I have a story called San Antonio that talks about what happened the day after the Alamo, when the mayor of San Antonio returns with the original 16 families. And this was based off of a conversation of a friend of mine as to how we should define the history of the Alamo. And I said, well, wait a minute. Okay, you have the Texas defenders, which you define as strictly Anglo, which we know is not true. And then you have the other side, which is the evil Mexicans. I go, but what about the people that were in San Antonio, the mayor, the civilian population, the gente of the city? Oh, well, they all left. They all left because they were afraid Santana was going to burn their houses. So they all left. And I said, so you're telling me that because I leave San Antonio because there's a storm coming, then I no longer live in San Antonio? So when I come back, it belongs to the guy who died at the Alamo? The guy who showed, no, wait a minute. What are you talking about? And so I wrote a story based on a book written by Dr. Tim Matavina out of Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame. It's called The Alamo Remembered. And it's all of these letters from the mayor of San Antonio, from people that were in San Antonio that were divided. You know, half the families were trying to support Mexico and half of them wanted to go fight at the Alamo, and were the Tejanos fighting against the Mexican forces. So there was, and it's a beautiful book. It's called The Alamo Remembered by Tim Matavina. And I said, this is the story of the Alamo I want to tell. This is the story of San Antonio. So I said, you know what? If I don't do it, they ain't going to write it over there. So I wrote basically kind of a Lonesome Dove type of story about an ongoing Netflix type of series about the mayor of San Antonio, and he brings back the original 16 families. And they're dealing with desolation. They're dealing with Fallujah, right? Their town has been completely obliterated. They're dealing with all kinds of forces, right, on either side. And they're trying to survive, and they're trying to bring the civilian life back to San Antonio, you know?
You've got to get that story told. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I've written the pilot, and it's got that Davy Crockett story reference in there. So, but again, if we don't control these narratives, then Hollywood isn't going to write them. So again, that I think is the long answer to your short question, Victoria, is that I think as artists, we need to take control of that. That's why I loved working on Vida, because Tanya, who's labored on other shows for years, was able to actually show run and control the narrative. And it was incredible to go onto the set and watch all of these people, especially our PAs and our ADs who weren't Latinos, all speaking Spanish. Because Tanya said, because half the script in Spanish, everybody's got to talk in Spanish. And so you had all of these people that didn't speak Spanish struggling to talk in Spanish because so it was a beautiful thing. And you got to see a lot of Latinos working in production in the studio. I was like, man, this is beautiful. Look at this.
If you go to Netflix and you tell them, look, just put the cast of Narcos Mexico in my film, I think it would be a great film.
Mm-hmm.
Vincent, did you have a question?
Miss Vicky, keep up the good work. That's one of our art mamas right there.
Yay, Vicky.
Hey, Jesse, we're big fans. I keep thinking about the movie. I like it like that a lot. It's an awesome. I loved you there. Hey, listen, we're huge supporters of VIDA, the show. One thing that does come up a lot, when we saw you, we were just like ecstatic. We took pictures of the TV screen, we paused it and everything. And so I'm having an issue, I guess, with not hearing Chicano on TV enough.
The word.
You know, and when I see you, I feel like you're you epitomize the Chicano, and then that show does bring up Latinx a lot. What are your thoughts about Latinx?
I think every generation gets to define themselves. You know, even though we were Chicanos, we were considered part of the baby boomers, right? So you can also refer to yourself as that. I think for us, Chicano, and the reason I define myself that way is because to me it represents all those different parts of me, not just Mexican American, but being indigeno, being Indian, being de la tierra, being de la cultura, you know, defining yourself as being raza, you know, del west side, del hueso, del south side, the East LA, the East Los, you know. And I recognize that because I lived in a lot of different cultural barrios. I lived in a ghetto. I lived in, you know, Puerto Rican barrio in Chicago. So one thing that I realized that universally, it's a way of feeling proud of who you are and where you come from. And we need that because frequently to define yourself, especially remember in the old days, if you defined yourself as a Chicano, as an Indian, as one of the people, you know, as Mexican at some point in Texas, you couldn't say that you were Mexican. You know, the beginning of the white Texas Republic, if you said there were more lynchings in Texas in a short amount of time right after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo than there were in the South of African Americans because they were slaves. They were the slaves. So the lynchings only happened every once in a while. There were more lynchings later in African American culture. But at that time, in the 1800s, when it became the white Texas Republic, we were being lynched because
let's not forget about
we had all the ranchos.
And let's not forget about the role of the Texas Rangers in that too.
Well, absolutely. And again, so to say that you were Chicano in the early 60s and 70s was a bad thing, considered a bad thing. But we were also trying to they were also trying to define themselves in that activist era, you know, the Chicano movement. So I think for me, being a child of that as a baby boomer, for me, it was like, man, Chicano says exactly what I want to say. Mexican American is too divided, you know what I mean? And if I don't associate necessarily with a nationality, I associate with my cultura, you know, with my culture. And it's a bilingual, bicultural culture. And it's got all these influences. So for me, it was easy to say Chicano. So when I got into the industry, though, you weren't really saying Chicano. And then I was lucky enough to do my first big movie, which was Blood In, Blood Out. I was a Chicano character, and I was doing Chicano art, the stuff that I had grown up on, you know. And I also grew up with conjunto music, you know. Flaco Jimenez, my father, Jesse Borrego, was an accordion player, so I grew up watching him perform with Los Haces de Texas. So for me, there was always this bicultural thing that was a natural part of me. And so Chicano kind of identified that for me. So as I got and in my family, my parents didn't hesitate to say Chicano at all, you know, because they were from the Chicano movement era. So I think that stayed with me. So as I became an actor and an artist, I said to myself, hey, how can I really set myself apart? You know what? I'm going to call myself a Chicano actor because there ain't no one else calling themselves that. As I got into the industry, I realized that there was something to be proud of and that I could use that. Fast forward years later, George Lopez is using it in his shows, you know, Chicano, brown and proud or whatever. And so it became commercial. And that's when I realized, hey, you know what? The redefinition of who we are and what we can say. So I think the long answer and the short answer to that is to say, now, I think now Chicano, what you're going to find is that Chicano is going to be defined as a period in time when we use that. And I think the new generation is going to start to redefine themselves in different ways. Again, there was an argument for a while about 10, 15 years ago when we weren't saying Chicano, we were saying Latino because everybody wanted to kind of unify as Latino cultures, you know, and Chicano was very specific to Mexican Americans, you know, and even other certain Mexican Americans wouldn't necessarily say they were Chicanos, right? So it was a definition of a kind of a lifestyle. So they start calling each other Latinos, right? I use it all intermittently. One time I went to an event, dude, a Chicano moratorium event, and I started saying, hey, be proud to be Hispanic, la, la, la. And they were giving me dirty looks, right? Finally, somebody come up to me and said, hey. And this was in 1980. This was in 1984, man, 1984. They came up to me and they said, hey, man, we don't say that no more. We don't say Hispanic, you know. And that's when I started saying Latino. But they didn't tell me to say Chicano, though, because there was Nicaraguenses there. There was gente from El Salvador. It was basically a junta of Chicanos, but to support the Latinos in Nicaragua, in Latin America, right? At that time, they were fighting against Somoza. So there was a meeting of two different Latin cultures. So we were trying to find a new way to redefine ourselves, and we were saying, we're not going to say Hispanic anymore. We're going to say Latinos. And that was the time that they started to say Latinos.
One thing that's important, I think, to pick up on your question, Vincent, is that because Latino and Latinx, I think you're right. There are some problems with that in the sense that it's like what you were talking about, Jesse, with Tecumseh. It's a unifying term. And it's important to have a unifying term and to come into these cultural issues and economic issues with a unifying force. But also, we need to maintain our own individual identities, because when you look at the demographics, Mexican Americans are like 60%, 70% of the U.S. Latino population, and Cubans are like 3%. But they wield a lot of power because they can hide behind this Latinoism and position themselves as the leaders and the point people and the gatekeepers. So as long as we can have representation within our own community, we can have representation in the larger community, but I don't think that we need to accept it if we're not being properly represented. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And again, that's the whole issue. The whole issue is about identity and representation of that identity. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, my thing is, viva la diferencia, man, you know, que todos sean orgullosos de su raza, you know, and everybody how they identify. If we can celebrate those things, then like Tecumseh said, if you don't define yourself as just Shawnee, because what Tecumseh recognized, he goes, look, when you Miami get together and you say you're different than us Shawnee, and we're the same raza, but you say we're Miami and you're Shawnee, right? These are two different Indian tribes. And Tecumseh was trying to unify us together because he goes, if we all get strong, then they're not going to be able to expand. You know what I mean? And we'll have our own country. We can call it Indian country, Aslan. That the whole idea of Aslan was unifying the landmass. It wasn't just Aslan is the Mexicas. And again, that was another problem the Mexicas were having, is the Mexicas were identifying, the Mexicanos were identifying as better than everybody else. Better than the Texcocos, better than the Tlaxcaltecas, better than the Perepuchas. And that's why when the Spaniards came, they used it against us, divide and conquer.
And actually, that's an interesting point.
Los Mexicas se creen mucho, you know, come with us and you'll be the better. The Tlaxcaltecas will be the ones. And that's why the Tlaxcaltecas fought with the Españoles, never realizing that, no, man, when the colony takes over, we're all Spanish citizens. We're all Indios. So it was the same thing with raza. When they keep dividing us, right, and they keep saying this or that, then that's when we're going to say, well, you know, they ain't part of us. The beauty of it is that even if you don't identify Latinx, the fact that you guys are loving the story of Vida, which is, hey, that's all Chicano right there, bro. But if they don't call themselves Chicanos as a new generation and they're calling themselves Latinxers, you know, that's beautiful, man. Embrace them, because those Latinxers, believe me, they love the Chicano moniker. They love the Chicano culture. That's exactly where Latinxers come from. They're our grandkids, man.
And also,
but they have to define themselves. You know, they have to find out who they are. It's that whole thing. Is that why do Chicanos love of a certain generation love Morrissey so much, right? El Morrissey from the Smiths, right? Well, it's because at that particular generation, that's what they were listening to. Along with everything else, the Smiths were defining what they were going through, you know. Have you seen that documentary? What is it? Looking for Sugar Man, or what is it? Searching for Sugar Man, or whatever. Who's that? Rodriguez, right? His name is Rodriguez. He was a contemporary of who's the man that sings like that? Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
But he was a better singer than Bob Dylan. He had the same style. And he was a
helped.
better writer. This vato, his music disappeared. Well, 20 years later, in the 90s, it became the music. His music became the music for the South African apartheid movement.
Anti-apartheid.
Anti-apartheid movement. And this, you know, a little Mexican American's music made it to become the part of South Africans' freedom movement. You know, so the fact that they didn't know what cultura he was, you know, they didn't know where he was from.
He was from Detroit. He was a Chicano from the Midwest.
Yeah. So, I mean, the beauty of it is that when you spread the love and you spread the cultura, and believe me, I was on that set. And trust me, the predominant culture there was Chicano. They may not have called it Chicano, dude, but it was Mexican American, man. And there was people from all different cultures there, but they were all trying to act Mexican American. Because Tanya's from South Texas, you know, Tanya Saracho. So her whole world, her whole ambiance, even though it was set in East LA, you know, it was very much rooted in Chicano culture and experience, you know. That's one of the things that I always say. I go, it's hilarious. There's always, you know, you got Puerto Rican actors playing Chicanos. You got all these stories being written, but if you look at our biggest American Latino films, they're Chicano films, right? La Bamba, Blood In, Blood Out, Selena, Mi Familia.
Born in East LA.
Born in East LA. I mean, even Up in Smoke, I thought it was a Chicano movie.
Big money
maker. To
too.
watch it, I was like, yeah, man, this is exactly like the barrio.
Well, I guess back to what you're saying and Vincent's question is that if you're producing the work, you can call it what you want. So if you want to call it Chicano, produce your own work.
Celebrate it, man. Yeah.
Hey, we have one question because, like I said, these conversations are all about Dreamocracy, and here's our little piñata with wings, our little.
Vincent, make sure to check out Phoenix, Oregon, my new movie.
So what's your dream look like? What does Dreamocracy look like to you?
You know, if you watch Phoenix, Oregon, you get a bit of what I believe is Dreamocracy. The fact that I can play a specifically Chicano, American Latino character in an American film with an Anglo best friend, and yet it celebrates the cultura. Carlos the chef is specifically who he is, but he don't cook tacos, even though his nephew owns successful taquerias in the movie, right? But I'm a pizza chef. But none of that is patronized, man. Gary Lundgren wrote a script where and the producer, Louis G, who also plays my nephew, the producer is, you know, he's Chicano from Phoenix, Oregon. You know, he really lives in Phoenix, Oregon. People go, there's Chicanos in Oregon. Man, there's Chicanos all over the United States. We're big in New York, man. There's a big Mexicano, Latino, Chicano culture in New York. So we're everywhere. Don't ever let them tell you, well, you guys are just over in the Southwest. So, you know, Louis' relationship with the director, he kind of wrote that in, and he's got this beautiful, supportive Latino familia in the story. But the fact that I didn't have to trip on it, I didn't have to argue with the producers or the writers, I didn't have to do what I did in Tecumseh, is sneak good lines in that represent the culture. I could just be myself. And then when I look at the film, it just celebrates who we are as Americans. And so I think that's Dreamocracy. If I can continue to work on projects like that, you know, I've got several that are specifically rooted in who I am as a Chicano and as a, you know, as an indigenous human being. And that's another thing is a lot of people go, you know, why do you love that word Chicano? I go, because it includes, Mexican American doesn't include my indigenous heritage and culture. And as Chicanos, we adopted the Aztec iconography, right? Quetzalcoatl and, you know, the Popocatépetl, you know, the El Guerrero holding la doncella and, you know, Moctezuma really we adopted that because we had no indigenous iconography. But if you look at the Southwest and what Latinos and Chicanos specifically are doing with their regional culture is they're identifying with their indigenous culture. You know, Jimmy Santiago Baca, incredible writer who wrote Blood In, Blood Out. If you get a chance, check out his documentary, A Place to Stand. It's an incredible documentary. He talks about how he learned how to write in the Arizona State Pen. But he's the writer, executive director, executive producer of Blood In, Blood Out. He wrote that Chicano Shakespeare stuff. You know, we come out chased by hounds, wearing a pinche rabbit's foot for luck. Que vida loca. That's Jimmy Santiago Baca. Well, he identifies as Isleta Pueblo, you know, the Pueblo, because he's from Albuquerque. So a lot of Chicanos are identifying with their indigenous part. And that's another reason why I think Chicano is all encompassing to a specific identity that you're at, you know. So I'd love to put a lot of that more in a lot of my flicas, Vincent, because that's kind of what I want to do. So I think that Dreamocracy is for me to just tell another 100 years of the Western from our perspective. How about that? That's my Dreamocracy. 100 years of the Mexican-American Western.
Yes.
I like it. Well, everybody, I mean, thank you, Jesse, for talking to us. It's really fascinating. Love your work. Phoenix, Oregon Movie is where you can check it out online, starting June 1st. So get your family together. I think it's like $7. So, you know, price of a popcorn at a
Phoenix,
movie.
Oregon party.
You have a Phoenix, Oregon party, phoenixoregonmovie.com. So let's all give Jesse a big round of applause. Thank you for being our guest today. Really appreciate your work. Doing great work out there.
So one more thing about Phoenix, Oregon. One more thing about Phoenix, Oregon. It comes out on iTunes Monday, right? But if you buy it this weekend in the next couple of days on Apple TV, you get it for half price. Half price. Resale.
Great.
A deal, a bargain.
Get it now. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Jesse. We wish you a good weekend there.
Love you guys.
Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thank you for being part of our
Very
conversation.
inspiring.
Love you, Jesse.
Dream on.